Hey everyone, and welcome to This Week on Point North. I'm Alistair Stevens, and it is good to be back. Let me tell you, I took a week off last week to take care of some behind-the-scenes updates and to do some general tinkering and some, preparatory foundational kind of work for the next phase of Point North Media, and also to relax just a little bit and to celebrate my birthday. But I missed you guys. I missed this. I missed podcasting. I missed talking about stories, though. That should not be taken as any indication that I did not talk about stories last week. I ended up talking a lot about stories last week and about the intersections of pop culture fandom and real life, I suppose. I ended up talking a lot about Star Wars last week with a group of friends here in Oklahoma City, and talking about the response to The Last Jedi, talking about the response to Solo, talking about the critical response to Solo, and more broadly, I suppose, the pseudo-commercial response to Solo. There's so much interesting discussion happening in that space, and also the pursuit of these really interesting news-breaking agendas, I suppose, where everyone needs to have an angle, everyone needs to have a hot take, so the initial response becomes conflated with a considered critical response. We're going to talk more about that this week as we look again at Solo in the context of story and Star Wars. Let's begin, though, with a couple of quick questions. Before I even gloss the structure of this week here at Point North, let's begin with a very important question. Was it Lynn? I'm scrolling back to look here now. Oh, was it Lynn? Laura, who brought up the prospect, the opportunity of Outlander Season 4, which I believe is airing in November of this year. Am I going to look at Outlander Season 4? Am I going to look at The Drums of Autumn before Outlander Season 4? Not in an in-depth considered way. I just don't have the time in my schedule, unfortunately, between here and there to do a week-by-week, chapter-by-chapter breakdown of The Drums of Autumn. But I would really like the opportunity to talk about Outlander. I would really like the opportunity to talk about Season 3 in particular, which I didn't get the chance to podcast about as it was airing. So, yes, probably some Outlander stuff. I think there's a decent chance that that is going to be a book club selection as we move forward. I don't think that I can add another regular podcast into the rotation at this point without incurring the wrath of medical and healthcare professionals who are looking askance at my schedule right now. But I would like the opportunity to talk more about Outlander and to talk about some of the really interesting work that was done in Season 3. Season 3 was not a comprehensive success, I think, as a season of television, but that doesn't mean that it isn't without value. And I certainly don't even think it was a disaster. I don't think it was a bad season of television. It was, of course, because it is both Outlander on the one hand and the Starz adaptation of Outlander on the other, it was a controversial season of television in a number of different ways, but it would be interesting to delve into that and talk a little bit about it. So no promises, but yeah, I want to. So we'll see how that works out. Yes, Marshall saying, Solo was great. It's not a groundbreaking movie, but it's a ton of fun, and I walked out with a lot of warm and happy feelings. I'm very glad to hear that, Marshall, I have to tell you, because I've been feeling a little bit out on a limb, out on a rocky and isolated promontory in the wild blue ocean of criticism and snark surrounding Solo, particularly in the context of this developing narrative about Solo's commercial failure that has been significantly overstated. I do not think that Solo counts anything near a commercial failure, or certainly not a critical failure. I think it is inessential. I think it is possibly a bit of a weather balloon for what happens next in the ever-expanding Star Wars universe, because, as we heard over the course of the last couple of days, there are currently 9 Star Wars movies in development at Disney. I'm not sure what to make of that. Of course, in development means precisely nothing. Most of those movies, more than half of those movies, I'm sure, will never be seen, will never reach even a significant pitch stage, will probably never have a completed screenplay. Some of them are going to make it into movie theaters, and there is, at the moment, a suggestion, an intimation that the audience is somewhat exhausted by Star Wars, that the Marvel audience is exhausted by MCU movies, that the DC audience, is exhausted by the DCEU movies. I'm just not sure that that's actually true. I'm not sure that that is in any way supported by the commercial or critical response. It seems far more likely to me that the real problem with Solo was that Avengers Infinity War ate its lunch. I think that is a part of the business of movie making that oftentimes goes unremarked upon. We like to believe with differing degrees of intentionality and different degrees of authenticity, I suppose. We like to believe that the creative arts are, in some senses, a meritocracy, that the best movies will always find their audience, and that the best TV shows will always triumph and continue on for 8 seasons in a movie, or that the best books will always make it to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and that just isn't true. These are businesses, and there are complicated behind-the-scenes tides, I suppose, of popularity and of, well, the absence of popularity. It's a complicated space. I like Solo very much as it stands alone. I like Solo probably less than the other, the new wave of Star Wars movies, but that's by no means a condemnation. I don't think that Solo is in any way a bad film. I do think it's a really interesting film. Okay, let's do the gloss because I want to talk about story in Star Wars in just a minute, but we will catch up. Art saying here, I am not exhausted by them. Yes. So Sundere says here, yeah, people thought Westerns were done in the 60s too. Hot takes are hot piles. Aaron, I love that. Hot takes are hot piles. Yes, the hot take culture on the internet right now. The hot take culture, right? If you're not familiar with this, if you're not in like these critical circles that talk about the critical responses to pop culture as they emerge, the hot take is just that opinion that you are obligated to have the morning after the release of a movie, or even the evening in which a movie is released, or after the first episode of a new TV show. You have to be able to have a considered opinion on the value of that TV show as a whole, and this is impossible. The problem is that hot take culture and the endless, restless desire for novelty that we see often on the internet means that the hot take response, the first initial unconsidered response, has, in some senses, over the course of the last year, I think, begun to eclipse a more considered discourse on the movies, the TV shows, the video games. God, if you think this is bad with regard to movies and TV shows, check out video game journalism, because my God, hot take culture is. I'm saying this, of course, the week after E3. The hot take culture in video games is just astonishing. Games can thrive or die based on the initial response to a 3-minute trailer, to a 30-second trailer, to a perceived response in the community. If you've been paying attention to the current rise of the battleground genre, to the battle royale genre, looking at the success of PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, the huge and astonishing success of Fortnite, the announcement that the new Call of Duty game is going to have are they doing a 100-player battle royale? I think it's a 100-player battle royale. The new Battlefront game, I think, has something very similar, which actually arguably makes more sense than the Call of Duty alternative. Hot takes are ruining our critical response to basically the pieces of art that we care most about, whether those are movies or TV shows or books or anything. So I'm, going to continue here at Point North Media to try and push back against hot take culture, while also kind of making a space for those immediate and emotionally anchored responses. I, of course, put out a response to Solo the morning after seeing it for the first time, which was intended as a placeholder for a more considered conversation that will come along later this week. Let's take a quick look here. Yeah, the Aaron pointing to E3 too. Yeah, no, it's pretty shocking. The response to Cyberpunk coming out of E3 is baffling in its way, right? Cyberpunk is an upcoming video game which has attracted a huge amount of very positive critical response from the video game industry, despite not actually presenting itself in a full and considered way. We don't even have what I would consider to be a standard video game preview, right? We've got a trailer for this game, and that is it. It looks great. Like, I'm very excited about it. I love cyberpunk culture, and I love cyberpunk aesthetics, and I'm super into this idea of the game, but it's not finished, and it's not a whole and complete part yet, and it certainly hasn't. The rubber of this game has yet to meet the road of the player base. So all of this is to say that hot takes are very, very difficult. Yeah. Let's see. Good. Marshall saying hot takes no longer about critical analysis, all about rapid trigger response and clickbait. That's it, right? And we can be very dismissive of clickbait as a concept. Clickbait, I think, came up in the previous generation of digital content, in the previous generation of the internet, by which I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, with the rise of things like BuzzFeed, the rise of things like Reddit even. And going back further, you can go back to Dig, and you can go back to StumbleUpon, and you can go back to internet communities that were oriented around this desire for novelty and the desire for immediate gratification. Clickbait is unfortunately an industrial necessity if you are writing on the internet. If you are creating things on the internet, you have to be there with your response, because if you are not, your audience is going to go elsewhere. There's not let me put it this way. In the best of all possible worlds, I am not opposed to immediate responses to pieces of art. Sometimes I think those immediate responses can be extremely valuable. Some of my favorite conversations that I've ever had with people are on the way home from the movie theater, or in the aftermath of the finale of the latest season of Game of Thrones or Outlander or whatever. You know, having that discussion where you allow your immediate emotional response to settle into a more considered intellectual response, those discussions can be fantastic. The problem is that the hot take is taking all of the air out of the room. Here at Point North Media, we try and push back against that, which is why we are going to spend the next few weeks over in the Patreon-exclusive book club discussing the hottest of all possible hot takes, Frank Herbert's 1965 science fiction novel, Dune. We're going to be talking a little bit about that, which I have been reading over the course of the last week. And as is my way, enjoying more than I ever have before. I have had a slightly combative relationship with Frank Herbert. I love Frank Herbert as a storyteller. I do not love Frank Herbert as a writer, honestly. His actual prose and his dialogue is replete with tics and with tropes which start to wear on me as we move through the book. This is particularly true of Dune. I think this is more true of Dune than any of the other Frank Herbert that I've read. But Dune even... It is a book that is in conflict with itself. The high-level storytelling, the underlying plot of what is happening is fascinating. The world building is brilliant. The world building is genuinely like genius-level world building. The movement of the plot is very, very strong. The actual prose is much weaker. But this time, for some reason, I am finding myself more engaged by that prose. And one of the things that really opened it up for me, in case you're reading Dune this week, this is kind of foreshadowing a brief discussion that we'll have on Friday in this week's book club session. If you're reading Dune this week, understand that Frank Herbert is giving us a very golden age of sci-fi omniscient narration. This is not a modern book. This is not the kind of science fiction novel that would be written, well, in any time after 1965. Honestly, it was kind of an outlier in 1965. It's kind of throwing back to golden age science fiction of the 1950s, even by the time that it is written, but it is possessed of a certain sweep and scope and gravitas. And if you're looking for finely nuanced character work in Dune, well, you are going to get it, right? There are moments of great sophistication and complexity with Frank Herbert's approach to character. Paul is, of course, probably the most interesting character there. But as we dip into the psyches of other characters, whether it's Jessica or Thufir is a really fascinating character as we move through this book in particular. We will get those moments of nuance and of complex characterization, but they will be fleeting. They will be presented to us as little vignettes, and then we will pull back out to look at the movement of the plot in a broader sense. All of that is fascinating. I should say this week, well, you know what? Let's do the calendar. I'm all just scattered and riotous this morning. I do apologize. But as I say, I've missed podcasting, you guys. I've missed talking with you all over the course of the last week. So we're beginning right now, here, today, with This Week on Point North. That is it for today. No book club tonight. The book club has had to be moved later in the week because, well, I'm rebuilding my studio. This is probably going to be... Well, I'm not entirely sure. It depends on when certain things arrive from Amazon. But either this session or tomorrow's DMP session will be the last that you will see with this background behind me. We're going to switch some things up here in a really good way, which is going to make for better audio quality, better video quality, better lighting quality. All of that is happening within the next couple of days. So I'm very excited for that. I mentioned Dear Mr. Potter, though. That will be taking place tomorrow evening, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, in an episode that I have somewhat snarkily entitled Calmly. You know the way that Dumbledore talks? Calmly. We're going to be talking about the movie adaptation of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, which is, I have seen this movie now 3 times in the course of the last week and a half, and it's not good is the problem. It's not good, and it is bad in ways that we have seen before from the Harry Potter series. It is bad in exactly the same way that I have argued that Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets are bad, and it is not good in the way that Prisoner of Azkaban is good. It cuts the material back to the bone, but it does so in a way that doesn't actually preserve the story. It preserves the content. It preserves those high point beats of what happens. It preserves the proper nouns at the expense of narrative consistency, of narrative coherence, of narrative transparency. But that is not to say that there aren't some fantastic things about the Goblet of Fire adaptation, and I think that it really comes into focus in the last act. There are also some fantastic performances throughout this movie. So we're going to have a ton of fun talking about that tomorrow night. That is 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central for Dear Mr. Potter 58. Calmly. Then on Thursday, we are going to make good on our long-awaited promise to make it to the cracks of doom. In There and Back Again 67, The End of All Things, we will study in basically comprehensive depth. I think I have pulled basically every word from chapter 3 of book 6 of The Lord of the Rings for slides on Thursday evening. We're going to look at the final fate of the One Ring. Frodo and Sam are going to make it to the Cracks of Doom in Rodruin, there in Mount Doom itself, and the ring will, well, be resolved as an outstanding plot point. Let's put it that way. So that is at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central on Thursday evening. That is going to be a really, really great reading. There is no chapter in all of The Lord of the Rings that is more crunchy, that is more thematically charged, that is more immediate and intense. It is absolutely shocking and ends on, well, it's a beat that we've seen before from Professor Tolkien. It's a beat that we've seen fairly recently from Professor Tolkien. Just a couple of chapters ago, as we ended book 5, we had that brilliant moment of despair from Pippin as he faces the battle at the Morannon and basically faces his own death. And now we're going to echo that here with Frodo and Sam, but we're going to do so in a beautiful way. It's going to be a really great discussion. So that's Thursday evening, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, there and back again, 67, the end of all things. Then on Friday, we are going to continue our second season of Story in Star Wars with a follow-up response to Solo. Also some kind of metatextual follow-up responses to the last episode of Story and Star Wars, which provoked some really interesting reader and listener responses, I have to say. So we're going to talk a little bit, 5-10 minutes, about The Last Jedi again, and then I'm going to talk a lot more about Solo. I'm going to talk a lot more about the intersection of noir storytelling and sci-fi storytelling. I'm going to talk a little about Solo through the lens of Blade Runner, I suppose. There's some interesting association and overlap, though it may not be immediately apparent. I think there's some substantial and thematic overlap there in a really interesting way. We're going to talk about the depiction and treatment of women, of course. We're going to talk about the depiction and treatment of fringe characters, I suppose, in the Star Wars universe. We'll talk about all of that on Friday. That's going to be a really fun discussion. And then Friday evening, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, the first episode in our discussion of Frank Herbert's Dune. That is what you can expect from Point North Media over the course of the next week. It is great to be back, as I say. Art saying, looks like I'm going to be crying on Thursday night. Hey, you and me both. We are going to... Yeah, it's been an emotional journey through The Lord of the Rings, particularly through Return of the King. I think there are some moments that hit the old heart, that get the old lump in the throat going, in the Two Towers in particular. Even back in Fellowship of the Ring, there were some moments that really profoundly move me. But yeah, The Return of the King, of course, is where Tolkien delivers on everything. And then it doesn't stop here, right? For all that this is the end of the book. If you are one of those readers who loves The Lord of the Rings up to this chapter, up to the end of the Ring story, and then kind of skims the long protracted denouement in Return of the King, my intent over the course of the next few weeks and there and back again is to make you fall in love with those gorgeous and luminous vignettes, to see how Professor Tolkien anchors in hope and in positivity and in conflict and in courage everything that he has established through the War of the Ring, from the very beginning of Fellowship all the way through to the climax at Mount Doom. I'm going to make you fall in love with the denouement. That is my plan over the course of the next few weeks. But before we get to that, of course, we have to deal with the climax, and that is going to be... Yeah, it's going to be emotionally taxing, I think, is what it's going to be, but I'm very much looking forward to it. Yes, Shane saying fringe characters in Star Wars, Dr. Bishop in space. Yeah, you want a little translocation of the cast of Fringe? I mean, what's Mark Valley doing these days, right? Like, we could probably get him into a Star Wars movie. I mean, we probably could, right? Now I'm okay. This is what happens. I am just throwing out very sillily, kind of picking up from Shane there and just thinking, yeah, Olivia Dunham in space. No, because Olivia Dunham in space would be amazing, right? Because Olivia Dunham is one of the greatest modern heroines. She is magnificent. If you guys haven't seen Fringe, of course, this is going to be meaningless to you, but I strongly recommend that you go and watch Fringe. It's very, very, very good. Yeah. They'd have to dye Olivia's hair brunette, right? Yeah, that's exactly it. We know how that is. Oh, John is asking, how far into Dune will the first session go? Thank you for that, John, because I was going to announce that and then forgot to. This first session is going to be relatively brief. I was planning on 8 sessions for Dune. I think it's probably going to be between 8 and 10. The first session is going to be the first 2 scenes. So we're going to get the extended Gom Jabbar scene with with Paul and the Reverend Mother and Jessica, and then we're going to do the scene with Baron Harkonnen 2. We'll do those two, and we're also going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about Frank Herbert. We're going to talk about the legacy of Dune. We're going to talk about the continuation of the Dune books after Frank Herbert's death. So we're going to contextualize the book and then just cover those first two scenes. We are then going to pick up and move much more swiftly as we move through the rest of the book. But that is the plan. Yeah, good. Let me see. Art is saying, yeah, I loved Fringe. I didn't expect it to be as good as it was. It's very, very good. Yes. Nice. Rome's is offering us a combo reference. What's in the box? That's it, right? That's our overlap for Fringe and Dune. You're completely right. Good. Yeah, Aaron's saying that the appendices alone for Dune would be worth a discussion. This was my first experience with a book that spoiled itself. The way that Dune spoils itself is, well, all of that ties back into this notion of the omniscient narrator, right? The little epigraphic insertions that we get between scenes, between what would conventionally be considered chapters, and I believe are, in some versions of the book, actually delineated as chapters properly. Not in the version that I'm reading, which is making this a little more complicated, though I must say I am actually heading out to my local independent bookstore here in Oklahoma City this afternoon to pick up a new copy of Dune because I have so thoroughly ruined my other copy. So I've also been listening to the Renaissance audio, he said, grabbing his phone so that he can check his Audible account. It is the Renaissance audio version, narrated by Scott Brick, Orla Cassidy, Ewan Morton, Simon Vance, Ileana Kadushin, and many, many other actors besides. I have been listening to that, as you'll know if you listened to... Was it This Week on Point North a couple of weeks ago, I guess, the last episode of This Week on Point North? I was not immediately charmed by that particular audiobook performance, but it has won me over. It's a very solid reading, so I would recommend that very highly. You can go and check that out on audible.com. Guys, we are 20 minutes in, and I think that is pretty much going to do it. We have some questions here in the... Angela's asking, is Tuesday just discussion of Goblet of Fire? Are we doing a live commentary event too? Here's the thing. All right, I am completely at your mercy on this one, Angela, okay? You and the extended Point North listenership. Goblet of Fire is 2 hours and 40 minutes. It's a very, very long movie, and a lot of it is not great. And I don't necessarily feel the need to do a commentary track for it. But if you guys really want to do a commentary track, if you really want to have that experience of hanging out live on YouTube and talking about it, then we can schedule something for next week. That I think we can definitely do. We are going to move on from Harry Potter next week. I will have information about that in tomorrow's Dear Mr. Potter session. I'll be able to lay out the next couple of weeks of DMP. We're not going to take a very extended hiatus from J.K. Rowling's works because, well, partly because I'm just eager to get into Order of the Phoenix, honestly, but and also because we're at a weird point. We're at a weird point of inflection in the Harry Potter series in terms of looking at other stories. So we're going to take a moment to look at The Worst Witch, and we're going to take a moment to look at The Sword and the Stone, and we'll look at some of the literary antecedents, I suppose, of J.K. Rowling's work, and then we'll circle back around to Order of the Phoenix. But yes, if you guys would really like a commentary track for Goblet of Fire, then let me know. Yes, that is in fact the first question too. There we go. I saw that in the in the question box and in the chat. Marshall is asking, given that a Star Wars story spin-off format allows for such a wide range of story styles and genres, what would your idea spin-off story be? Something featuring characters from the expanded universe, old or new, another backstory moving like Solo, or something wholly original? There is a problem with Solo. And I'm not going to spoil what the problem with Solo is because I know that many people haven't yet seen it. But those of you who have seen it will know what I'm talking about when I say that in the third act, Solo makes a swing for connectivity and relevance with the wider Star Wars universe. And that is always, always, always going to be a problem with Star Wars. Star Wars has defined itself, particularly in this new era, as being so rigidly about a single story that the expanded universe as we had it, back in the day, back in the 1980s, back in the 1990s, is going to be very difficult to do in the context, not in books and in comic books and in other forms, video games, for example, right? We're going to be able to have real, true spin-off standalone stories in those spaces. Can you do a Star Wars movie that does not touch the core premise of Star Wars? I think probably not. Okay, I think you could. I think this could happen. I don't think that it will happen in the context of modern Disney. I think that Star Wars is a very defined thing right now on the big screen. I would like, though, to see some more independent narratives. The problem with that is that we are already, I think, running into running into a smaller world space than we might want for Star Wars. One of the things that makes the original Star Wars trilogy so great, particularly the original Star Wars movie so great, is that it explodes onto the screen with this infinite canvas. We've got so much in every possible direction. You know, I talk all the time about that scene between Obi-Wan and Luke, where Obi-Wan talks about his father and talks about the Clone Wars and talks about, you know, the lightsaber, and it just, proper noun, expands the universe. It gives us what Tolkien referred to as the illusion of depth, right? This is the notional concept that the universe is vast and that we don't have to account for every particular detail. I'm very glad that Solo, generally speaking, dodges that bullet. Solo doesn't need to give us the origin of his lucky dice or the stripe on his pants or, you know, the scar on his chin or like anything else that we have to do. It's not the first 5 minutes of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which is a movie that I also love, but definitely does that thing of, no, here's everything that is definitive of Indiana Jones presented to you in a neat 5-minute encapsulation. We don't really do that in Solo. There is always going to be a temptation to do that in the Star Wars universe. If we're going to do that, it's really hard. It's really difficult to think of an area that we can delve into that would allow for that expansion. I'm very excited about the suggestion, the assertion, I suppose, that Rian Johnson's trilogy is going to be completely distinct from the main thrust of the Star Wars serial. I don't know if that's going to be true. I just don't know if I can trust that at this point, particularly given the metatextual interactivity that is so prevalent in The Last Jedi, right? Rian Johnson is clearly a writer and a director who has a lot to say about Star Wars and wants to say those things, and giving him a trilogy that is completely disconnected from the numbered episodes in the Star Wars series is a bold choice, a strong choice. I think he could do good work in that space. I just don't know how interested he is in doing good work in that space. I'm expecting that to, at the highest level, kind of circle back around. For me, I would like to see more stories, not on the fringes of Star Wars, but in the cracks of Star Wars, I suppose. I would like to see an entire story taking place on Corellia. I would like to see an entire story taking place on Tatooine. I would like to see an entire story taking place on Coruscant during the period of the Empire, you know? I think there are innumerable stories that you can delve into. Let's go to Nar Shaddaa. Let's talk about the Hutts and their crime syndicates and talk about how that thing all works. We can delve into, you know, the Knights of the Old Republic era and talk about like the golden age of Jedi, which, well, no, okay, we can't. We're never going to do that. I can't imagine that we would do that on the big screen. But there are stories out there to be told. I suppose of all the ideas that have been floated so far, and given that I'm not at all confident about Rian Johnson creating a genuinely standalone trilogy happening way out on the wild frontier of the Star Wars universe, given all the ideas that have floated around, the one that I am most positive about is the Obi-Wan storyline, is the Obi-Wan prequel set on Tatooine between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. I think that Obi-Wan is still an unresolved character. And returning to Obi-Wan now with sufficient perspective on the prequel trilogy in particular would be a really strong choice. I don't know how that character gets from where he is at the end of Revenge of the Sith to where he is at the beginning of A New Hope. He feels, he seems, he reads like a completely different character. I don't think that's necessarily indicative of a characterization break. I do think that you can arc that character from Ewan McGregor to Alec Guinness, right? But I don't necessarily have the information that I need on the big screen. Obviously, there have been innumerable novels and backstory expansions exploring some of that space, at least. But I think that there is potential for... Okay. This, I think, is what I'm working toward very slowly here. What would I like from Star Wars standalone stories? Character pieces. That is what I want from Star Wars standalone stories. I don't necessarily care so much about the largest plots that we're seeing in Star Wars. The numbered episodes are great for that, but I would like to see real character pieces. Give me some depth on these characters. I think that Solo, kind of almost by implication, right? Almost in its absence, Solo manages to do that because the version of Han that we get in Solo is not the version of Han that we get at the beginning of A New Hope. He's a very different character, but because he is so different, we get a gesture toward what is going to happen to him over the course of the next 10 years. And I think that is genuinely fascinating, genuinely provocative. So I would love to see, a story set on Alderaan. Let's talk a little about young Leia. How did Leia become who she became? Leia is such a magnificent character now in the Star Wars universe, and I would love to see how she became. Leia growing up growing up on Alderaan, growing up under the tutelage of Bail Organa would be magnificent. And we can cast Jimmy Smits, right? We can get Jimmy Smits back in. We can get Ewan McGregor back in for Obi-Wan, and we can get Jimmy Smits back in for Bail Organa. We can make this happen, you guys. I think, but yes, characters is what I want. Good. Okay. Wow. And I'm almost out of time here. Who is suggesting? Rhea is suggesting Padme. I would love more of Naboo, honestly. I think that there's some really interesting stuff happening on Naboo. Give me Padme between Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. I think there's some really interesting character development there. I think that, I'm very interested in the diplomacy, and of course very interested in our oftentimes overlooked, oftentimes underutilized, oftentimes discarded, oftentimes fridged, oftentimes abused and neglected female characters in the Star Wars universe. That's one of the things I'm going to be talking about on Friday with regard to Solo. Let me see if I can take one more question here. Brandon asks, Quirrell and Voldy would have been able to get the stone, wouldn't have been able to get the stone until Harry shows up. You catastrophe or just catastrophe, asks Brandon about the end of Philosopher's Stone. Yeah, it's okay. Narratively. Ultimately, you catastrophe. Ultimately, things are going to turn out for the best. I'm not sure. The problem with eucatastrophe isn't just that bad things turn out to be good, right? And eucatastrophe, as used by Professor Tolkien, doesn't just mean that disaster can sometimes lead to positive consequence. Eucatastrophe means specifically the idea that in disaster, the universe is cracked, like the world is cracked and light pours in because ultimately the world is good. Ultimately, all of creation is good. And of course, Tolkien is seeing this in a very Roman Catholic oriented kind of notion of intercessory grace, as I've said before in the context of There and Back Again. I don't think that J.K. Rowling believes that the world is fundamentally good, and I certainly don't think that J.K. Rowling believes in that kind of intercessory grace. So the mechanic of eucatastrophe would therefore be very different between Harry Potter and the works of Professor Tolkien, to the degree that I wouldn't call it eucatastrophe. Do good things happen because bad things happen in Harry Potter? Yes, absolutely, all the time, right? We can talk about the gaining of the Philosopher's Stone. We can talk about the resurrection of Voldemort. In general, we can talk about the death of Cedric Diggory. We can talk about innumerable points of conflict. Sirius Black being hurled into Azkaban will ultimately turn out to be, well, if not for the best, then at least a means by which good things can happen. I'm not sure, ultimately, and I say this now from the context of having just studied Goblet of Fire, but also thinking about the entire series of Harry Potter, does J.K. Rowling offer a consistent and cohesive viewpoint on good versus evil in her fictional world? I don't think that she does. I don't think that is her primary thematic focus. I'm not sure that J.K. Rowling would acknowledge a capital G good or a capital E evil in her world. More often than not, what we see in Harry Potter is those people who are isolated and who fail, and those people who are unified and thus succeed, right? It's so much more about community and friendship and loyalty and family than it is about capital G good. More on that as we continue to move through the darkest era of the Harry Potter, the Harry Potter story. One last question here from Becca. Are we doing anything for American Gods Season 2? Nothing's on the slate right now, honestly. Possibly. I'll have to wait and see. I don't have a plan for American Gods Season 2 right now, and certainly some of the stuff that I'm seeing coming out of American Gods Season 2 gives me pause, gives me a certain amount of concern. So I probably won't commit to an entire review of American Gods Season 2, but that doesn't mean that we can't do some book club discussions. It doesn't mean that we can't do some discussions here on This Week on Point North. I'm certainly planning on watching it, so I'll have some thoughts to share. But no planned podcast on that for the near future. But who knows? Who knows? We will see. You guys, I'm already over time. I can't believe it. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I will see you all, hopefully, for tomorrow night's discussion of the movie adaptation of, I said the moody adaptation of Goblet of Fire, which is true in a number of different ways, you guys. This is a super gothic Hogwarts that we're going to get in this Goblet of Fire adaptation, but we're going to talk about that tomorrow night with Dear Mr. Potter. That is at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. I hope you will be able to join me for that. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, enjoy your Mondays.